What's up, everybody? Ryan Thomas here, live on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast YouTube channel as well. You'll be tuning in on audio on the Spotify channels or the Apple Podcast channels of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Sorry for the late introduction on the audio side. Getting everything, kind of short up here so I can do a bit of a simulcast where when I'm live on YouTube, people can watch it. And when I'm live on YouTube, that means I'm live on Spreaker.com, which means I'm live on Spotify as well as Apple. And I've greatly enjoyed doing this sort of simulcast, if you will. It's really awesome. It's allowed a lot of people to tune into the show, far more than what I was accustomed to prior to it being just an audio version of the podcast. And, getting this whole setup here with this backdrop and everything like that has been really awesome. People are loving it, and I'm loving it too. Safe to say I'm loving it too. So thank you so much for the support. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Today on the show, we'll be diving into the UFC Bantamweight Division. That is the 135-pound weight class, currently a weight class that does not have a champion. So unlike shows, days past, light heavyweight division, diving into the middleweight division, both of those divisions that we have taken a dive into within the last few days have champions, whereas this UFC Bantamweight division does not have a champion. And I find that fascinating right now in terms of the landscape of mixed martial arts in the UFC. The number one organization in mixed martial arts does not have a 135-pound champ, but that will change relatively soon as Peter Yan and Jose Aldo will be fighting for the vacated UFC Bantamweight Championship. And that will be July 11th on the stacked, loaded, heavy loaded UFC 251 card. I'm very much looking forward to tuning into these fights on July 11th. I actually requested the day off from my day job and got an alert this morning that I got the day off. So I could not be more thankful that I put in for that day, got that day. I'm going to be, live pretty much prior to the fights that day. I'll be diving into those fights that morning in detail. We'll obviously dive into those fights in the coming weeks and stuff, but I wanted to wait a little bit, wait to put a show out for that. Obviously, being that it's in a few weeks, but I will do some discussions leading up to it, so that'll just be a little bit of a carrot to dangle in front of the in front of the viewers and listeners. So diving into the UFC Bantamweight division, as well as taking some questions that were submitted on my Instagram account at Ryan Thomas Take. I posted in my story that I wanted to take some questions and get some reactions from you, the folks at home. So rather than me diving into the Bantamweight division for now, let's dive into some of the questions that we received. So Ty B, good buddy of mine, Ty B says, will the Buffalo Blue Jays win the World Series? I mean, I wouldn't mind that one bit. Wouldn't mind that one bit at all. I know the Boston Red Sox aren't. That's my team. For a 60-game season in the major leagues, this 2020 season, I am more than willing to accept the fact that the Boston Red Sox are going to be not that great. And it's not due to the fact that their hitting lineup is poor. I mean, they're Mookie-less. They don't have Mookie. But that lineup is still pretty stacked. I mean, JD Martinez, Rafael Devers, Andrew Benintendi, Xander Bogaerts, who for my money I think is one of the more underrated players in this game, in the game of baseball. I look at these guys and I say, this lineup is pretty goddamn good. I mean, it's one of the best in the majors, definitely one of the best in the American League. But in the case of, the Buffalo Blue Jays, that was a nice little tidbit there for everybody. The fact that you have X amount of people out there saying that, the Yankees are favored, the Dodgers are favored. I'm going to give some shout outs to the Toronto Blue Jays because they are getting better. Maybe they're not World Series favorites this year, but they definitely are getting better. I love the players that they've brought in. Their last draft pick last week or a week and a half ago, I'm very high on him. The name's not coming to me right now, but talked about him on yesterday's show when we discussed baseball coming back. And, I think the Tampa Bay Rays are definitely getting better. They're definitely going to be a team to watch, especially in a 60-game season where the season's shorter. And, you're really relying on your bullpen. You're really relying on your starting pitching rotation to, be at the top of the heap. And, Tampa Bay's pitching very good. Blake Snell, Tyler Glasnow, but Toronto, Marcus Stroman less. They got Hyun-Jin Ryu. I like Ryu, but he's definitely nowhere near as good as Stroman, and I know Ty B will agree with me on that. Stroman's his boy, so I'm just putting this out there to the Twitter sphere, and very, very excited to be live right now. So next question that we have here, on my Instagram is Poirier versus Hooker. I feel Dustin will take it, but I want your take on it. And that was from Owen. Owen says, Poirier versus Hooker, I feel Dustin will take it. I'm actually looking at the betting lines of that fight, and I'm not really a betting man, but I do like to bet on the fights. It does add a different wrinkle, and it does kind of create a different anticipation for me. Poirier versus Hooker, I really feel that Hooker is far better than what most people are saying. I don't feel like he's gotten the full credit that he deserves heading into this bout with Dustin Poirier. I really like Dan Hooker. If he's a massive underdog in this fight, I'm definitely going with Hooker. I'm going to take that because I think Hooker is very dangerous on the feet. He's butchered plenty of fighters, in the last couple fights, especially Ali Quinta. Paul Felder fight, I did lean towards Felder a little bit towards the end there, but, I think Hooker really knows what's at stake here. What's at stake is an opportunity to be in the running for that UFC lightweight title. And that lightweight division, we're going to dive into that tomorrow night. That lightweight division, and I say we, meaning me, I'm going to dive into it tomorrow night. That lightweight division is up in the air. I mean, there's no clear-cut path in this UFC lightweight division with Khabib, being up in the air, with Conor being up in the air, Khabib up in the air for reasons that are far out of his control. And thoughts and prayers go out to his father, who's battling COVID-like symptoms at one point, and now he's out of the COVID stuff, but he was in very bad shape and is still in very bad shape. And my thoughts and prayers go out to Khabib's dad. I know that they're very close, and largely Khabib's father is a huge factor in the development of Khabib as the fighter that we know today. So Conor McGregor, who knows what the hell's going on with him? I mean, it's like throwing a dart at a dartboard with a blindfold on. You hope to hit a bullseye every once in a while, but sometimes you're, hitting the left side of the board, right side of the board. He's just coming from all different angles. I really have no idea what his path is in this UFC lightweight division. So if Dan Hooker can pull off the victory against Dustin Poirier, I think it's very possible that Dan Hooker could pull off that victory against Dustin Poirier. And I really like Hooker. He's long, he's rangy, he's lanky, he's tough, he's durable. Really, Dustin Poirier is going to have to put that fight in his wheelhouse, and I think it's going to be a barn burner for sure. But I'm going to take Hooker on that one, actually. Greatest fighter to never win a UFC belt. Man, that's really tough. Great questions, by the way, so far. Greatest fighter to never win a UFC belt. I'm going to go with my guy, Dan Henderson. Dan Henderson fought at heavyweight. He fought at light heavyweight. He fought at middleweight. Had two titles, specifically in Pride, the 185 and the light heavyweight title in Pride. Fought the who's who, beat Fedor Emelianenko in the Strikeforce days. I'm going to go with Dan Henderson, actually, as the fighter to the greatest fighter to never win a belt. And he was so close to winning that UFC title in his rematch with Michael Bisping. I actually thought he won that fight. Granted, it was really, really close. And as the rounds waned on, that age started to show for old man Henderson. But what a story of what a storied career Dan Henderson had in terms of his mixed martial arts, just top to bottom, accolades galore, longevity up the wazoo. I mean, longevity is putting it lightly. I mean, this guy was fighting in 1996 and retired in 2016. So this is a guy that I grade 2017. This is a guy that I really admire, and without a doubt, Dan Henderson a shoe in. I mean, he's already in it. He might as well be shoe in for the Hall of Fame. His fight with Shogun Rua was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame, but on his own, Dan Henderson should be in the UFC Hall of Fame. He's a phenomenal story and one of the best fighters of all time, in my opinion. I would put him in my top 10. And I talked specifically about how CBS Sports puts together their top 10 greatest MMA fighters of all time. And I thought the list was shit. I thought the list was terrible. I thought it was very recency bias. You got to sprinkle in some of the guys that paved the way to make the sport what it is today. And Dan Henderson was one of those guys. Dan Henderson was a great fighter of yesteryear and recent present day. I mean, to have that much longevity in a mixed martial arts realm is unprecedented. So Dan Henderson, for me, that's my vote of confidence for a fighter that never won a UFC belt, but really doesn't matter. I mean, it would have been great for his career if he won a UFC title, no doubt about it. But, he came up short against Anderson Silva. Tore his knee prior to fighting John Jones. I would have loved to have seen that fight. I think Henderson would have been a very, very interesting matchup for John Jones. And, I'm not saying he would have won that fight, but the fact that we didn't get to see it sucked. And then the Bisping fight at 185, his last fight of his career, his last opportunity, and he came up just short. So Dan Henderson, one of the best. Favorite fantasy football wide receiver in 2020? Man, this is really tough. I would have to say my favorite fantasy football wide receiver has been DeAndre Hopkins the last few seasons, but I am a little bit leery, I should say. I'm a little bit leery of of DeAndre Hopkins on his new team, the Arizona Cardinals. I typically don't like to take a wide receiver that just switch teams. I like to wait and figure out whether I'd like to take a more established wide receiver and go from there. I think with a wide receiver like Michael Thomas, it's very tough to deny his greatness as far as what he's been able to put out there stats-wise the last few years with Drew Brees as a starting quarterback. And I know that there's a lot of contentious, I guess, vibes within that Saints locker room right now, given the statements that Drew Brees made and then made afterwards. But I think Michael Thomas and Drew Brees are still one of the best duos in the National Football League, quarterback wide receiver duos. And I'm not saying that just because he's got the same last name as me. I think that's a coincidence. But Michael Thomas, I think, will be the number one receiver on everybody's fantasy football wide receiver boards, and rightfully so. I mean, this guy has been dominant. He's been tearing it up. And he's a guy that I think should be the first wide receiver off every fantasy football draft board. You got Michael Thomas, you got DeAndre Hopkins, expecting a big year from Mike Evans now that Tom Brady is in the fold in Tampa Bay. Mike Evans had a bit of a down year, so we'll see. And last and final question, how do you see Khabib and Gaethje going down? I think this fight will actually be far closer than what most people think. I think Justin Gaethje, for the first couple rounds, is going to give Khabib some trouble. And then Khabib will probably close out the show via ground and pound or a submission once he starts to really enact those wrestling tactics. I think that's what we're going to see from Khabib and Justin Gaethje. I'm really excited for that fight. In terms of Justin Gaethje's ability, he's a very, very, very good kickboxer. I mean, his ability to attack the leg, to attack the calf early in a fight, I think is going to give Khabib some problems if Justin Gaethje is able to implement that right out of the gate. Very much looking forward to this fight. I think of any fight in the UFC outside of Khabib and Gaethje, one that I'm really looking forward to, shout out to this fight, is Adesanya and Costa. but Adesanya and Costa, not as pizzazz as Khabib, due to the fact that Khabib got that win over Conor. His name's a little bit bigger, due to the fact that Justin Gaethje got that win over Tony Ferguson. I'm very much looking forward to that fight as well. Very much looking forward to Khabib and Gaethje, but I do see Khabib taking it. I think Khabib is going to take it. So, all right, those were the questions. So now we dive in to the UFC Bantamweight Division, a division with no champion. Poirier and Jose Aldo will do battle for the title, and very much looking forward to that fight among the 3 title fights on July 11th. You got Jan versus Aldo, you got Volkanovski versus Holloway, and then in the main event, you got Kamaru Usman versus Gilbert Burns. I am so very much looking forward to diving into these 3 fights on this podcast. But for now, I want to dive into the division, the state of the division, and go from there. So the UFC Bantamweight Division, we're going to dive into the UFC rankings here. Marlon Moraes is number 1. Aljamain Sterling is number 2. Oddly enough, Marlon Moraes is number 1 and not getting this title shot. But what made him or allowed him to be number 1 was a terrible decision by the 3 judges that scored the fight between Marlon Moraes and Jose Aldo. I thought that Jose Aldo won that fight. And luckily enough, the UFC matchmakers thought that Jose Aldo won that fight because Jose Aldo got the title shot against Henry Cejudo due to things that were out of his control, the COVID-19 stuff. Jose was stuck in Brazil, so he could not come to the UFC Apex, and stepped in Dominick Cruz to take on Henry Cejudo. Henry Cejudo gets through Dominick Cruz, and then Henry Cejudo vacates the UFC 135-pound title. And that came as a little bit of a shock to a lot of people, but it didn't really come as a shock to me due to the fact that Henry Cejudo has been competing for the majority of his life, was not getting paid the amount that he wanted to. And this COVID-19 pandemic, it's, kind of silly to put yourself out there to fighting during all this stuff. But hey, the UFC needs to trudge along, and, they're the Trojan horse. So Cejudo beats Cruz. Jan was in line for a title shot. He's won 9 straight fights. His last win was against Uriah Faber, who's a legend in the sport, obviously. And Jose Aldo, is also a legend in the sport. Also a guy that, UFC featherweight king. For my money, he's still the greatest UFC featherweight of all time, regardless of his loss to Conor, regardless of what happened in that fight, the 13-second knockout that happened to Jose Aldo, regardless of what happened in his fights against Max Holloway, even 2 straight losses to Holloway. I still consider Jose Aldo the greatest UFC featherweight ever. I mean, he was undefeated for, 9-10 years. Remarkable, unbelievable. And, I consider Jose Aldo the best UFC featherweight for those reasons. Defended the belt against the, challenger after challenger after challenger, and, was definitely a all-time great champion. So now for Jose Aldo, the opportunity is massive. Not only can he go down as one of the greatest featherweights of all time, in my opinion, the greatest featherweight of all time, but he could add a second UFC belt to his resume and add that champ status, maybe not simultaneous, but a 2-weight division champion in the history of mixed martial arts would be Jose Aldo if he comes away with a victory over Peter Yan. And I think what makes that fight so interesting is that those guys are former training partners. Those guys work together extensively. And word on the street is that Jose Aldo butchered Peter Yan on the feet. I mean, that was 3-4 years ago. I'd like to think that Yan is far better. This 9-fight win streak has him momentum-wise at an all-time high, mentally, physically. I'm sure he is, firing on all cylinders right now, as I like to say. But, Aldo, Yan, we're going to find out who the champ is. But this division right now, as a whole, is very, very exciting. I mean, Marlon Moraes, I don't think he got past Jose Aldo whatsoever, but he's a great fighter. He stood toe-to-toe with Henry Cejudo, gave Henry Cejudo a lot of trouble in those early rounds of that fight. And then you got Aljamain Sterling, who's coming off a massive win over Corey Sandhagen. I took Sandhagen in that fight, and, that was a real toss-up fight for me. I mulled that over, I think, more than any other fight in recent memory, mulling over the Sterling-Sandhagen fight. I think Sterling is a great fighter. And he proved that. Taking Sandhagen out, a guy like that, in short, swift, devastating fashion was what put him in line next for the title. No fight should be offered to Aljamain Sterling but the winner of Poirier and Jose Aldo. That should be the next fight for Aljamain Sterling. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So Cody Garbrandt ranked at 4, Jan ranked at 3. We talked about Jan. Garbrandt ranked at 4. He's coming off a big win over Rafael Assunção. For a guy that was coming off of 3 straight losses, 3 straight knockout, TKO knockout losses. The win over Assunção was massive for Cody Garbrandt, and I think he's going to get a big opportunity. Maybe he does fight Marlon. Oddly enough, now maybe he could fight Sandhagen. What would be interesting about the fight between Garbrandt and Marlon would be that they train together in the Mark Henry gym, and Garbrandt is a new fighter within that gym. Maybe he'll fight Marlon Moraes and have to go back to Team Alpha Male. You got Sandhagen. Pedro Munoz is taking on Frankie Edgar, who was also being thrown into this mix at 135 pounds. Oddly enough, Jose Aldo and Frankie Edgar fought for the featherweight title not once but twice, and now they're both fighting at the UFC Bantamweight Division. Aldo getting this title opportunity, and Frankie Edgar taking on number 7, Pedro Munoz, in short order here. I'm really looking forward to the debut, the Bantamweight debut of the former UFC lightweight champ, Frankie Edgar. Jimmy Rivera, Cody Stamann, Rob Font, Dominick Cruz at 12 with 2 straight losses to Garbrandt and Cejudo. I don't know what's next for Dominick Cruz. I really don't. You talk about greatest featherweight of all time and Jose Aldo. I think you can make the same claim for Dominick Cruz as a bantamweight. I just don't know what is next for Cruz. I just don't know. Who would be a name that he could fight? Maybe Cody Garbrandt. Maybe you do that rematch, rewind that one. Pardon me. Maybe you put him in there against John Dodson to get him, a quality opponent, somebody that would be an entertaining fight, but somebody that I think he could beat. I don't know what to do with Dominick Cruz. That's the one question among the many questions that I have in regards to what to do for this fighter, what to do with this fighter. Dominick Cruz, I got no clue what to do with Dominick Cruz. And then the subject matter really comes into play here. The 14th ranked fighter within the UFC Bantamweight Division, Sugar Sean OMalley. You're looking for the next superstar in the sport. You're looking for a guy that is charismatic and eccentric and fun to watch fight and fun to watch outside the octagon as well. Sugar Sean OMalley, I mean, this guy is the next big thing. I'm fully willing to say it, and I'm not eating any crow whatsoever in saying it. I've liked watching this guy fight since the Dana White Contender Series. He has been so fun to watch inside the octagon, outside of the octagon. I just got done watching Sean OMalley on the Food Truck Diaries with Brennan Schaub. The guy exudes charisma. It pours out of him. The guy is just very fun, very unique. He looks like he could be James Franco's brother in Pineapple Express. I mean, the guy is just hilarious, and I think he's a breath of fresh air in a UFC that has needed a breath of fresh air. Very much so, I think, since Conor really stepped into things inside the UFC. There hasn't been that one guy, that one fighter that has really made himself into a star. And I think Sugar Sean OMalley has a little bit of that. He's got a little bit of that flash, that flair that is unique, though. It's unique to him. It's not really comparable to Conor. It's his own, and he's very original. I'm trying to say very original in the mode that he brings to the table. What he brings to the table is very unique to him, and I think it's unique to fight fans as well. The question is, what do you do with him? What is next for Sugar Sean OMalley? What do you do with Sean OMalley? I think that you got to build him up slowly And I'll give you some comparisons for the fight fans at home that feel that Sean O'Malley should be rushed, should be given a Cody Garbrandt. They want to see O'Malley versus Garbrandt. I don't want to see that yet. I'm not ready for that. I don't think Sean O'Malley is ready for that. Maybe he is, but let's say he isn't. Let's say he is. Regardless whether he is or isn't, I want to see Sean O'Malley fight somebody that, could push him up the rankings just a little bit, give him that momentum, give him that positive bump, give him a fighter that fights like him. So we're seeing a knock 'em, sock 'em, robots war between O'Malley and an opponent A or B. Not that we want Sean O'Malley to go through 15 minutes of hell. We want Sean O'Malley to fight a stand-up fighter. We want Sean O'Malley to fight a guy that is willing to fight him. We don't want to see Sean O'Malley get wrestled to death, get humped to death by a wrestler. And me saying that, I'm not throwing shade at anybody. I wrestled and I appreciate wrestling. I'm just talking about for the viewers that want to see Sean O'Malley fight. They want to see Sean O'Malley fight. They don't want to see Sean O'Malley get pushed against the cage, pushed against the fence. They want to see Sean O'Malley fight. And I think, Marlon Vera, who just fought Song Yadong, there's a lot of rumors about Marlon Vera fighting Sean O'Malley. I think that makes a ton of sense because with O'Malley fighting Marlon Vera, I thought beat Song Yadong. And it's another top 15 opponent for Sean O'Malley that would push him a little bit, inch him a little bit closer from 14 to maybe 12 or maybe 11. Let's just inch Sean O'Malley closer to that top 10. And like I said, I could give you comparisons. I mean, I could give you cases of a fighter that was rushed far too quick in Cody Garbrandt. I could give you, a case of fighters that were moved along slowly in John Jones. John Jones was moved along very slowly. We knew what we had in John Jones, a true talent. The talent was there. They put him up against a fighter by the name of Vladimir Matyushenko, who was very long in the tooth, 42, 43, but had skills and had fought on a real big stage in the UFC for practically his entire career. And John Jones, did what he had to do. He took out the vet. It's a young man's game. You move on, onward and upward. I want to see more of that from Sean O'Malley. This win over Eddie Wineland was a very big win. This win over Eddie Wineland was a nasty, nasty win for Sean O'Malley. I gotta grab something here. So my buddy was in here. My cat Gus was in here. So I didn't even know it. He was over there. So I definitely feel as if you have a huge case on your hands of a fighter that is very talented, no doubt about it, but a fighter that needs to be moved along slowly. If they try to rush this with Sean O'Malley, I think it's going to blow up in their face. I fear that. I don't think it's going to, but I do fear that for Sean O'Malley. So I want to see Sean O'Malley get moved along slowly. I want to see Sean O'Malley move up the ranks in slow fashion. And my hand looks messed up. And I'm talking to the viewers. So I think that's what you need to do with Sean O'Malley. I don't want to see him fight Dominick Cruz, for Christ's sake. I don't want to see him fight someone that's a vet like that. I want to see him fight someone that is a vet that will stand and trade with him and, not make him look like he's, an amateur. I want to see Sean O'Malley continue to grow, continue to get better. Right now, the sky's the limit for this kid. We look at the next year, 2 years for Sean O'Malley. A lot of positive things coming. And another guy that they brought up slowly within the UFC is Conor McGregor. I mean, they brought him up slowly. He fought a guy by the name of Dennis Seaver, who was a vet in the sport. It was a big win for him at that time. Dennis Seaver, not really a challenge to Conor before the fight, when predicting the fight, and wasn't a challenge during the fight, and wasn't looked at as a challenge after the fight. But that's not the point. It's about building the name of the fighter off of the names of other fighters. There's a term in combat sports, it's called stepping stone. We're not looking for Sean O'Malley to fight scrubs, but we're looking for Sean O'Malley to fight guys that will elevate him and, pay it forward a little bit for these older guys. Pay it forward in the fact that it's a young man's game. These older fighters that want to continue to stay around, they can stick around, but they're only going to get knocked down a peg by the younger fighters. And that's the way it works. That's the way combat sports works, whether it's boxing, whether it's MMA. No disrespect to the older fighters, but this is common case of what happens. A common case of what happens. Younger guys move up the ranks, and the older guys fall down the ranks. It is what it is. So there you have it. That is my UFC Bantamweight Division overview as well. I took some fan questions at the start of the show. Thank you so much for submitting those. You can submit those on the Ryan Thomas Take Instagram story, which is now expired. But, when I post on my Instagram, if you follow me on Instagram at Ryan Thomas Take, and I post taking questions for the podcast, you want to submit those. You want to get those out there. So very much looking forward to the future of this show. I've been grinding, putting out YouTube videos every day when I have time to do so. Very much looking forward to posting more YouTube videos on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast YouTube channel. Very much so. Very, very much so. So thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. I will be back on probably sometime later in the day, maybe today or tomorrow. Either way, though, this has been a very fun week and a half since we added this software to the repertoire of the Thomas Takeover, and I very much enjoyed it. Very much appreciate everybody that's tuning in as well. Leaving comments on my Facebook about the videos, posting these to Facebook groups, whether it's all the Buffalo Bills Facebook groups that I'm a part of, or MMA Facebook groups that I'm a part of, or any other sport, baseball, hockey. I've dove into Sabres, Bills, MMA, baseball. I mean, can't get much better than that. So thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. Take care.